Bobby is somebody who does not have a fight in this fire. He is somebody who started analyzing the science, looked at the science, and couldn't stop looking at the science because it's just so overwhelming that we have a major, major problem here. And this is a guy who I think is a true American hero, doing the right thing, and he's got great things to say, so I'll introduce him.
Thank you, Eric. As Eric said, I got kind of dragged kicking and screaming into this fight, and I got dragged in by a series of extraordinary women who year after year, after I spoke on mercury coming from power plants, would come up to me after my speeches and say, you need to look at the science about mercury and vaccines because it is by far the largest vector for mercury exposure to our children. And I was reluctant to do that because it wasn't really in my wheelhouse, but I'm comfortable reading science. I do that for my job. I've tried hundreds and hundreds of cases. Almost all of them involve scientific questions. And I started looking at this science, and it was so shocking. And then I began calling the other side. I began calling the top people at CDC, Kathleen Stratton, Colleen Doyle, and people like Paul Offit, and asking them to explain the science to me. And when I started listening to them, it didn't make any sense. And I realized that they had nothing to stand on, and the science was the science, and I continued to pursue it. And here I am today, and I'm pro-vaccine. I had 6 of my kids vaccinated. I think that vaccinations save millions of lives, and that we ought to have policies that encourage full vaccination, full coverage, but that's not going to happen until we have safe vaccines, and until we have a regulatory agency that has integrity and credibility with the American public. And that's what we ought to be focusing on. That's what our government officials ought to be focusing on, is restoring integrity to CDC. And CDC is a very, very troubled agency, and it's not just me saying this. There's been 4 separate scathing federal studies by the United States Congress, a 3-year study by Congressman Burton, a follow-up study by Senator Coburn's committee, another study by the Inspector General in 2008 of HHS, and a study last year by the Office of Research Integrity of HHS, and all of those studies paint a CDC as an absolute cesspool of corruption, as an agency that has fallen under the spell of this trillion-dollar big pharma industry, and instead of serving its primary mission, which is to protect public health, its mission now, according to the federal government, federal studies, is to serve the mercantile interests of vaccine industry. So, and there's 2 areas of corruption in the CDC vaccine division. The first is the division that chooses which vaccines to add to the schedule. Now, when I was a little boy, I got 5 vaccines. My children got the older ones got 22 vaccines. The younger ones got 69 vaccines. And these vaccines keep getting added to the schedule. They began in 1989. The CDC changed the schedule and doubled the amount of mercury in vaccines. They did that because in 1986, the pharmaceutical industry was given by Congress immunity from lawsuits. So it suddenly became very, very profitable to make vaccines, and an industry that once had been kind of a stepchild of big pharma now became one of the profit centers, because they could make a product that the federal government orders 189 people to buy. There's no advertising, there's no marketing, the patents never expired, and you can't be sued. So no matter how badly you make that product, no matter how many defects it has in it, nobody can ever hold you accountable. So they began making these vaccines and adding them to the schedule, and when a pharmaceutical company adds that vaccine to the schedule, the value of it to that company could be as much as $1 billion. And we would expect and we would hope that the advisory committees that make the decision to add new vaccines to that schedule would be independent scientists who have nothing in mind except the safety of our children. But that's not true. What the Inspector General report, and I urge those of you in the press to go look it up, it's the 2008 Inspector General of HHS. What they said is that virtually all of the members of those committees have financial entanglements with the vaccine companies. And I'll give you an example. Dr. Paul Offit, who many of you know, who is a vaccine industry tycoon and insider, the principal promoter of vaccines in this country for the vaccine industry, is on the vaccine industry payroll. He, in 1999, sat on the committee that approved and added the rotavirus vaccine to the schedule. At the time, he was working on on his own rotavirus vaccine. That opening that gateway by adding that vaccine to the schedule made his patent extremely valuable. And 6 years later, he sold that patent for $182 million and pocketed about $40 million himself. So that kind of financial entanglement by the people who are deciding what vaccines to add to the schedule makes it difficult, I think, for all of us to believe that the only thing that they're thinking of is our children's health. And what the Inspector General report said is that 97% of the people who sit on those panels have the same kind of financial entanglements and conflicts of interest as did Paul Offit. So there are now 16 vaccines, 69 shots, inoculations that our children get. There are 271 new vaccines in the bureaucratic pipeline at CDC waiting approval, and in all likelihood will ultimately be added to the schedule. And Paul Offit says that he believes that it's blue sky for Wall Street after that, because he has said publicly that he thinks children can take as many as 10,000 vaccines. Oh, and when you go to these vaccine committee hearings, it's not a bunch of scientists in white lab suits. It's a bunch of Wall Street analysts in suits. And as soon as that decision is made, they run out of the room and get on their cell phones, and you can watch that stock price spike. So these are financial decisions. They're being driven by a trillion-dollar industry, and we need to restore the integrity of that agency. Now, the other part of the vaccine division, the other is the immunology safety division, which are the scientists who are charged with making sure that our vaccines are safe and efficacious. But what we now know, what we've known for years from looking at the science and the phony epidemiological studies that they produce, we've known for years that this division is extremely corrupt. But what we now know, because the senior scientist at CDC, the 17-year veteran, Dr. William Thompson, whose name is the lead author on the most important of those studies, has now in August invoked whistleblower status, federal whistleblower protection, and has hired Morgan Verkamp, one of the leading whistleblower attorney in our country, and has said publicly that CDC, as Eric said, what they do in that the CDC scientists in that division have been required by their bosses for at least a decade to lie, to manipulate, to massage data, and to bury data that connect neurological disorders, including autism, to thimerosal exposure and to vaccines. So we need, and he has turned over tens of thousands of pages of documents to Congress, and at this point, what we need is Congress to do those hearings. He wants to be subpoenaed and to testify so that the American public, for the press, the American press will finally have to begin covering something that we have known about for a decade. And now, here's the problem, is that all of the checks and balances in our society that normally would protect children from a rapacious industry have been neutralized.